Okay, on the line today, it's one of the friends of the program around here, Kevin Seifert, national writer for ESPN. Kevin's been giving us his time for a long time, ever since he was a beat writer for the Star Tribune back in the day, but he's joining us now to talk about the current status of the Minnesota Vikings and the National Football League. Hey, Kevin, how's it going, man?
I'm good, Wobby. How are you?
We're doing pretty well here. We're fresh off a rookie minicamp. You know how exciting those things are.
It doesn't get a whole lot better. There was a day, by the way, and not too long ago, where all 3 days of the rookie minicamp was open to the media, and one year they decided to close it and just make the Friday open to the media, and I don't think a single person complained.
Yeah, I can believe that. And I got to tell you, it might feel like it's been a lot of years since you've been there, but not much has changed. It's the same thing.
I hear you.
It's the same thing. With that being said, you know, after all the mock drafts and the short shuttles and the flying 20 times, it is nice to just actually see these guys play football rather than do drills, you know?
For sure. And you got to be careful to not draw too many conclusions, because football in shorts is not football, but you at least see what people look like, how they move, all the non-contact skills that they may or may not have. So there's some use to it for the people who want to see it.
Yeah, and for the Vikings in the draft, the first 4 picks, and I believe it was 7 out of 12 overall, were offensive selections. And you kind of take a look at what has happened around here in Minnesota since the offseason began, and a lot of talk about the offense. So I'm curious, from your perspective, a national perspective, Kevin, the changes, the movements, what do they suggest to you that Kevin Stefanski wants to do with this offense in 2019?
Well, I think the perception that it's certainly continuing to feed is that this is a team that's gearing up to run, I don't know, more often, but certainly more powerfully, more efficiently, and more reliably.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things that, you know, I know there's going to be a narrative that Mike Zimmer just wants to run the ball 100 times a game. I don't know if that, you know, passes the common sense test, or even that he wants to run it more than he's going to throw it, or anything that would be clearly different to the naked eye from what they did for a good portion of last year. I just think that they want, at the very least, to be in position to be able to run in certain situations where they did not try last year, at least during the early part of the season. And so that's sort of the perception of nationally of what they're doing. I know we talked about the idea that there is no real, you know, scheme family that Kevin Stefanski belongs to, and that's a good thing, because it's going to leave people guessing. You know, the Gary Kubiak schemes are well defined, but we don't know exactly how those are going to be integrated. So I think for the good thing for the Vikings is that even post-draft and even as minicamps start, the exact nature of the scheme probably remains not only in development, but behind closed doors for the time being.
Yeah, and I think to sort of dovetail off a point that you made about Zim, you know, being vocal about wanting to run the ball more and what is the perfect ratio, I think that's up for debate. It depends on what team you are and what your personnel is. But I think in terms of a trait that you want your team to have, Zim wants his team to be gritty and physical. And I think for him, he views running the ball as being gritty and physical and setting a tone. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and, you know, there's ways to do that through the passing game, especially whether it's, you know, screens or, short shovel passes or things that still involve, close to the line of scrimmage activity. But there's no doubt, you know, that there's times when you need to simply overpower. There's times when you need to overpower the defense, whether it's in short yardage or whether in the 4-minute drill. There's times when you can have the greatest, you know, show on turf, but if in certain situations that require and demand power and just strength on strength, if you can't win those battles, then you're not going to win the game. And I'm not sure. I'm very positive that is what he's referring to.
Yeah. Staying on the topic of Coach Zimmer and his defense this year, obviously the core of the defense remains intact, and really a big moment in the offseason was the re-signing of Anthony Barr. So there's going to be a lot of familiarity and continuity for this defense, which is good. How about, though, the creative mind of Coach Zimmer? You know, do you see any curveballs, any changes that maybe the Vikings could make on defense to keep doing what they've always done because it's always worked, but not grow stale or stagnant? Do you see any interesting wrinkles that could happen?
I mean, it's potentially, one of the things that Mike Zimmer has always done really well, and one of the reasons his defenses have always been really good at, is sort of disguising until the last possible second what they're really going to do. Mm-hmm. And a lot of teams do that as well, and a lot of teams are trying to emulate, frankly, the standard that he set on that. And so I'd imagine, there's some things that they have done, some of those things they've done better than others in terms of doing that disguise. And over time, teams can get used to that and be able to predict what are the possible options that they might turn to right before the snap. Is it going to blitz the corner and have the defensive end, take the flat, or vice versa, or the different coverages that you can switch to out of this particular formation. And so, a lot of it's just self-scouting, just to make sure that you're not repeating the same patterns. You're not, maybe come up with a few new wrinkles in terms of adjustments, and just making sure that, teams that have played against you for 5 years or 6 years are not able to just pull up the old tape and make better educated guesses as to what you might do. And so I don't know that he's going to dramatically change anything. Some of it might depend on what the health situation of his secondary is. But for the most part, I think that's where people can probably look to in terms of how do you freshen up the defense, how do you keep offenses on edge. It's making sure you're not repeating patterns in terms of the way you adjust in those pre-snap situations. Yeah,
it's always fun, the chess match between this is such a big-time coaching league. I'm sure you agree, Kevin. I mean, coaching really matters in this league, and when you get those coaching chess matches, it's so fun to watch, and it can be, an offensive head coach against a defensive head coach, like a Sean Payton against a Mike Zimmer, like that chess match to watch, and Bill Belichick and Andy Reid, like those are so fun to watch, the game inside the game,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and it's why most people say the two most important jobs in a franchise are the coach and the quarterback.
Yeah.
And probably in that order, depending on who they are in each case. But there's no doubt that when you have what's a lot of rules and a lot of structure designed to allow teams to acquire personnel evenly, and when the most talented teams, there's going to be some very talented teams and some very poorly talented teams, but the vast majority are right there in the middle next to each other. So how do you differentiate? And that's where coaching comes in.
Yep, that's right. I think sort of what you've described, the margin between good and not good enough being so razor thin is going to apply to the NFC North this year, Kevin. I think it's going to be a pretty stacked division. I think it's a talented and good division, but I also think it's a tight division. So no matter what you think of the teams and how good they are, I don't think you can debate that these teams are pretty closely matched. What do you think about the NFC North and handicapping it for 2019?
Yeah, it's every year I always start off saying that you got to, the team to beat is the one that won it last year, and you go from there. Statistically, and Bill Barnwell, my colleague, does an annual column like this, and I'd be shocked if the Bears don't fall into a category that makes them most likely to regress to the mean, simply because of how well things went for them from a health standpoint, from a sort of a surprise scheme standpoint, and if they can match or even come close to what they did last year, that's pretty impressive. It's interesting that the main storyline around them right now is whether they can find a kicker. And if the biggest issue you have is finding a kicker, then maybe you have a pretty stacked roster. But we'll see how fate and chance impact them this year. I've been fascinated with what's happening with the Packers. I mean, I can't remember a time when they've seemed so hell-bent on really stacking their defense. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but we've seen them have some drafts where very heavy defense, but they had a heavy defensive draft and signed a ton of free agents to big money contracts. So I think a lot of people are very interested to see what they're going to do with all those guys and how that's going to affect the way the team plays. And what it means. Does it mean that they no longer think that Aaron Rodgers is going to single-handedly lead them to a Super Bowl? If that's the case, that's probably a good idea, because we've seen him have, Hall of Fame years and still not get there. And so that in itself is noteworthy. And it's noteworthy that they were looking at quarterbacks pre-draft. And, some people thought maybe they were just, putting out a little subterfuge to try to get people to trade with them. And, the guy that they brought in was Drew Lock from Missouri. And it turned out that Denver traded up to get him in the second round. And sure enough, they traded right above the Packers. So I think at least the Broncos were thinking that the Packers were seriously looking at someone who could potentially one day replace Aaron Rodgers. So that is just a really, a series of really interesting dynamics going on in Green Bay. It doesn't mean they're going to have a terrible season or a great season, but just means that a lot of wheels are turning there, and some wheels that we haven't seen in quite some time.
Last thing for you, Kevin, any rules changes, any conversations coming up here at owners' meetings or, competition committee meetings, anything that football fans should be keeping their ear to the ground to, and anything in particular that you're working on at ESPN.com?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is, I think they've tabled the idea in March of guaranteeing both teams possession in overtime to sort of prevent the situation we saw in the AFC Championship game where the Chiefs are at home and they go to overtime and they lose before Patrick Mahomes ever gets on the field. And so there's been some discussion about reviving that at the May meetings later this month, potentially only for the playoffs. We'll see if that comes to fruition or not. And the other big thing that they're working on, it's really going to be a story of the summer and into the season, is just exactly how they're going to review offensive pass interference and defensive pass interference, because we had a big debate about whether they in March about whether they should even do it or not, and eventually owners bought into it and they're going to do it. But that leaves a really big question: is what exactly is clear and obvious pass interference, and what is just a debatable pass interference call? And that's the standard they're going to have to define. So that, because as you know, there's contact between receiver and DB almost every play. Most of the time an average person could look at it and say, that shouldn't be a penalty, or I can see where that would be a penalty. And those are not the type of calls that they want addressed here. They only want the kinds that we saw in the NFC Championship game with the Saints, and guys just, drilling people before the ball gets there and it's obvious to everyone. But that's a subjective thing, and two people could be asked to define what's clear and obvious and come up with entirely different answers, and they both could be right. So that's the challenge that Al Riveron has and the competition committee has, and they got to figure it out in an equitable way and teach it to the officials who are going to carry it out during the games by the summer. And that's a quick turnaround. So that's work that's being done right now, and hopefully we'll have at least a little bit of a better idea on that when camps open in July, if not when official mini camps start, because it would be nice to be able to give players the idea of what they're going to be judged on and what they're not going to be judged on in terms of potentially overturning calls.
Okay, well, we know that you'll be following that story and many others as the competition committee and the owners and all the fine folks get together to meet and discuss it and decide. So we know you'll be covering it at ESPN and ESPN.com. And we thank you, Kevin, for taking a few minutes today to chat with us. Always fun to have you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, man.
Yep, see ya.